On a quiet afternoon in March 2019, 17-year-old Marcus Chen was breaking ground for what should have been a simple backyard vegetable garden behind his family's modest ranch house in northwest Houston. The soil was harder than expected, stubborn clay that fought back against every swing of his shovel. 3 feet down, the metal blade struck something that rang out like a bell. Not rock, not root, but concrete. Smooth, deliberate concrete that had no business being buried in a suburban backyard. What Marcus uncovered that day wasn't just an oddly placed slab. It was the first tangible clue to one of Houston's most methodically executed and thoroughly forgotten crimes. A robbery so precise, so quietly devastating, that it had vanished from public memory along with nearly $3 million in cash. The concrete Marcus found had been poured in 1974, just weeks after 4 men walked into the headquarters of a local grocery chain and disappeared with enough money to change lives forever. For 45 years, that concrete had kept its secret, until a teenager with a garden project and a stubborn shovel started asking questions that no one had thought to ask in decades. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. In the summer of 1974, Houston was a city caught between its oil boom past and an uncertain future. The economy was shifting, neighborhoods were changing, and local businesses were fighting to stay relevant in an increasingly corporate landscape. Among them was Meridian Foods, a family-owned grocery chain that had served Houston's working-class communities for over 20 years. Founded by Lebanese immigrant Samir Khalil in 1952, Meridian had grown from a single storefront to 14 locations scattered across the city's east side and northern suburbs. The company's success wasn't built on flashy marketing or corporate efficiency. It was built on trust, cash transactions, and the kind of personal relationships that kept customers coming back week after week. Khalil knew his suppliers personally, extended credit to families during tough times, and maintained a cash-heavy operation that reflected both his old-world business instincts and the practical realities of serving communities where bank accounts were often secondary to weekly paychecks. By 1974, that cash-centric approach had made Meridian Foods both profitable and vulnerable. Every Friday, managers from all 14 stores would drive to the company's modest headquarters on Airline Drive to deposit their weekly receipts. The building itself was unremarkable, a converted warehouse with offices tacked onto the front and a loading dock that handled both administrative functions and light distribution duties. No armed guards, no sophisticated security systems, just a heavy safe in Khalil's back office, and a routine that had remained unchanged for over a decade. The weekly deposits were substantial. Each store generated between $15,000 and $30,000 in cash receipts, depending on the location and the season. During good weeks, the combined deposits could exceed $400,000. All of it funneled through that single office before being transported to the bank on Monday mornings. It was a system that worked because it was simple, predictable, and built on the assumption that nobody outside the company knew how much money moved through that building every weekend. That assumption proved catastrophic. On Friday, August 16, 1974, the routine proceeded exactly as it had for years. Store managers arrived throughout the afternoon, each carrying canvas deposit bags filled with bills, checks, and coin rolls. The money was logged, sorted, and secured in the main safe, according to a process that Khalil himself had designed and personally oversaw. By 6 in the evening, the headquarters was quiet, except for 2 employees who remained to finish the weekend paperwork and prepare Monday's bank deposits. Those employees were David Ruiz, Khalil's nephew, and the company's bookkeeper, and Patricia Morrison, a secretary who had worked for Meridian since 1968. Both were trusted, long-term employees with clean records and no financial difficulties. Both knew the exact procedures for handling the weekend deposits, and both understood that the safe contained more money than either of them would earn in 5 years of steady work. At approximately 7:30 that evening, 4 men approached the building's main entrance. They wore dark clothing, carried identical canvas bags, and moved with the kind of coordinated precision that suggested careful planning rather than opportunistic crime. The office lights were still on, and through the front windows they could see Ruiz and Morrison working at their desks, unaware that they were being watched. What happened next was captured only in the testimony of the 2 employees, both of whom survived the encounter but provided accounts that differed in crucial details. According to the initial police reports, the men entered through the unlocked front door without any apparent difficulty. They spoke quietly, avoided unnecessary violence, and demonstrated intimate knowledge of the building's layout and the location of the safe. Ruiz later told investigators that the leader of the group, a man he described as being in his 30s with a slight accent, asked specific questions about the weekend deposits and seemed unsurprised by the amounts involved. Morrison recalled that the men referred to each other only by first names, spoke in what sounded like rehearsed phrases, and appeared to know exactly which keys opened which doors. Neither employee was seriously injured, though both were restrained and locked in a supply closet while the safe was emptied. The robbery itself lasted less than 20 minutes. By 8 o'clock, the men were gone, taking with them not just the weekend deposits, but also several boxes of business records that had been stored near the safe. The precision of their selection suggested they knew which documents might contain information about company operations, employee schedules, or banking procedures. They left behind smaller bills, loose change, and anything that would have been difficult to transport quickly. When Ruiz and Morrison were discovered the following morning by Samir Khalil himself, the scope of the loss became immediately apparent. The safe had been emptied of nearly $2.9 million in cash, checks, and money orders. The missing business records included customer account information, supplier contracts, and internal financial documents that would take months to reconstruct. More troubling still, the thieves had taken items that seemed to have no immediate value, including a leather-bound ledger that contained decades of handwritten notes about company operations and relationships. The Houston Police Department's initial response was swift, but ultimately ineffective. Detective units canvassed the neighborhood, interviewed employees and suppliers, and launched an extensive investigation that would consume thousands of hours over the following months. The FBI was brought in due to the interstate nature of some of the stolen checks, and federal agents began tracking currency serial numbers and monitoring suspicious bank deposits across Texas and neighboring states. Yet, despite the massive scope of the investigation, physical evidence was virtually non-existent. The thieves had worn gloves, left no fingerprints, and avoided contact with any surfaces that might have retained trace evidence. The getaway vehicle, if there was one, had not been observed by any witnesses. Even the method of entry remained unclear, since the front door showed no signs of forced entry, and both employees insisted they had not intentionally let anyone into the building. The case quickly attracted media attention, but the coverage was surprisingly brief. Within weeks, other crimes had displaced the Meridian Foods robbery from newspaper headlines, and the investigation faded into the routine work of detectives who had no suspects, no witnesses, and no leads worth pursuing. Insurance payouts were processed, the company struggled to rebuild its operations, and the stolen money seemed to have vanished as completely as the men who had taken it. By the end of 1974, the active investigation had been scaled back to periodic reviews and follow-up interviews. The case file remained open, but it joined hundreds of others in the growing stack of unsolved crimes that characterized urban policing in the mid-70s. The concrete that Marcus Chen would discover 45 years later was poured during those final months of 1974, just as the investigation was losing momentum and the trail was going cold. What the investigators couldn't have known was that the concrete Marcus discovered decades later had been poured not by the original thieves, but by someone with an entirely different connection to the case. The slab wasn't hiding stolen money or evidence from the robbery itself. Instead, it marked the burial site of something far more mundane yet infinitely more valuable to solving the crime. A collection of personal belongings that had been hastily discarded by someone who knew exactly what they represented. The property where Marcus lived had changed hands multiple times since 1974, passing through a series of owners who had no knowledge of its previous occupants or their activities. City records showed that the house had been purchased in late 1974 by a man named Roberto Vega, a shift supervisor at a chemical plant who had paid cash for the property and lived there alone for nearly 3 years before selling it and moving to California. Vega's name had never appeared in connection with the Meridian Foods investigation, and his departure from Houston had gone unnoticed by authorities who were still focused on more obvious suspects. When Marcus brought photos of his discovery to his parents, they initially dismissed it as leftover foundation work, or perhaps the remnants of an old patio. But Marcus was persistent, and his questions about the oddly placed concrete eventually reached his neighbor, an elderly woman named Rosa Martinez, who had lived on the street since the early 1960s. Martinez remembered Roberto Vega clearly, not because he was particularly memorable, but because his behavior during his brief residency had struck her as unusual. According to Martinez, Vega had been a quiet, solitary man who worked long hours and rarely interacted with neighbors. But in the months immediately after he moved in, she had noticed him working in his backyard at odd hours, often late at night or early in the morning. She recalled seeing him mixing concrete by hand, something that seemed strange for such a small residential lot. More puzzling still, she remembered that he had burned several boxes of papers in a metal drum behind his house, creating thick smoke that had lingered for days and prompted complaints from other neighbors. Martinez had never connected these observations to any criminal activity. In the 1970s, it wasn't uncommon for residents to handle their own home improvements or to burn personal documents rather than risk identity theft through careless disposal. But when Marcus showed her the photos of the concrete slab and mentioned the date it appeared to have been poured, she began to wonder whether Vega's nighttime construction projects had been more significant than they appeared. The connection between Roberto Vega and the Meridian Foods robbery would have remained buried indefinitely, if not for a chance encounter at the Houston Public Library. Marcus had become fascinated with the mystery of the concrete slab and had begun researching the property's history using online databases and archived city records. During one of his research sessions, he struck up a conversation with a retired Houston Police Department detective named William Thornton, who was using the library's microfilm readers to research old cases for a book he was writing about unsolved crimes. When Marcus mentioned the concrete slab and the time frame of its construction, Thornton's interest was immediately piqued. As a young detective in the 1970s, he had worked peripherally on the Meridian Foods case, conducting interviews and following up on tips that had ultimately led nowhere. The case had frustrated him for years, not because of its complexity, but because of its apparent simplicity. The robbery had been too clean, too well informed, and too efficiently executed to have been the work of random criminals or desperate amateurs. Thornton asked Marcus detailed questions about the property, the concrete slab, and Rosa Martinez's recollections about Roberto Vega. Something about the timeline troubled him. The robbery had occurred in August 1974, and Vega had purchased the property just 3 months later, paying cash for a house that would normally require financing for most working-class buyers. The timing wasn't necessarily suspicious in itself, but it represented the kind of coincidence that experienced detectives learn not to ignore. More intriguing was Martinez's description of Vega's behavior, particularly his tendency to work at unusual hours, and his decision to burn boxes of documents. In Thornton's experience, People who destroyed papers in backyard fires were usually eliminating evidence of something they didn't want discovered. The fact that this had occurred so soon after one of Houston's largest cash robberies suggested a connection that might have been overlooked during the original investigation. Thornton contacted his former colleagues in the HPD's cold case unit and shared Marcus's discovery and Martinez's recollections. The department's interest was immediate but cautious. After 45 years, physical evidence would be extremely difficult to recover and analyze, and witness testimony from elderly neighbors would be challenging to verify. However, the Roberto Vega connection represented the first new lead in the case since the late 1970s, and it deserved thorough investigation. A record search revealed that Roberto Vega had indeed moved to California in 1977, settling in Los Angeles where he had continued working in chemical plants until his retirement in the early 2000s. He had died in 2018, taking any secrets he might have possessed to his grave. But his personnel files from the Houston chemical plant, where he had worked, showed some interesting details that hadn't been apparent during the original investigation. Vega had been employed as a shift supervisor, a position that required him to manage schedules, coordinate with other departments, and maintain detailed records of production activities. More significantly, his work often brought him into contact with drivers and logistics coordinators who handled deliveries throughout the Houston area. This included drivers who serviced local businesses, grocery stores, and other establishments that dealt primarily in cash transactions. The chemical plant's client list from the 1970s included several companies that had business relationships with Meridian Foods, either as suppliers or service providers. While this didn't prove any direct connection between Vega and the grocery chain, it established that he moved in professional circles where information about local businesses and their operations would have been readily available through casual conversation and industry networking. Perhaps more telling was Vega's financial history during the period immediately following the robbery. Bank records from the mid-1970s showed that he had made several large cash deposits in the months after purchasing his house, deposits that seemed inconsistent with his salary as a chemical plant supervisor. The deposits weren't large enough to represent proceeds from the robbery itself, but they suggested access to cash that couldn't be easily explained through legitimate employment. The pattern of deposits was also suspicious in its timing and methodology. Rather than making regular, predictable deposits that would reflect normal paycheck cycles, Vega had made irregular deposits of varying amounts, often waiting weeks between transactions. This behavior was consistent with someone who was deliberately avoiding the kind of regular banking activity that might attract attention from authorities investigating large-scale financial crimes. When investigators examined the concrete slab that Marcus had discovered, they found that it covered a rectangular depression approximately 4 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 2 feet deep. The depression had been carefully excavated and lined with plastic sheeting before the concrete was poured, suggesting that it had been designed to preserve whatever was buried beneath it rather than simply to dispose of unwanted materials. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed that metallic objects were present beneath the concrete, objects that appeared to be consistent with metal containers or boxes. The discovery prompted the Houston Police Department to obtain a court order for excavation, a process that would require careful archaeological techniques to preserve any evidence that might have survived 4.5 decades underground. The excavation began on a humid Tuesday morning in late September 2019. A team of forensic archaeologists worked alongside Houston Police Department investigators, carefully removing the concrete slab that had protected its secrets for nearly 5 decades. The process was painstakingly slow, each layer of soil documented and photographed before being removed. What they found beneath the plastic sheeting wasn't stolen money or evidence from the robbery itself, but something far more revealing. 3 metal ammunition boxes, the kind used by military personnel to store sensitive equipment, had been buried with military precision. Each box was wrapped in additional plastic and sealed with heavy-duty tape that had somehow survived the decades underground. The first box contained what appeared to be personal documents, photographs, and handwritten notes. The second held clothing items, including a dark jacket and gloves that matched witness descriptions from the night of the robbery. The third box was the most significant, containing a collection of items that would finally connect Roberto Vega to the Meridian Foods heist. Inside were detailed hand-drawn maps of the grocery chain's headquarters, complete with notations about employee schedules, delivery times, and security procedures. The maps were drawn on graph paper and pencil, with measurements and angles that demonstrated intimate knowledge of the building's layout. More damning still were copies of internal Meridian Foods documents, including employee schedules and cash handling procedures that could only have been obtained through inside access or extensive surveillance. The documents revealed the scope of planning that had preceded the robbery. Notes written in Spanish and English detailed the movements of store managers during their weekly deposit runs, the typical amounts of cash involved, and even personal information about key employees like David Ruiz and Patricia Morrison. The level of detail suggested months of careful observation and planning, far beyond what casual criminals might have invested in a single job. Among the most intriguing items was a small leather notebook filled with names, addresses, and phone numbers. Many of the entries corresponded to employees of companies that had business relationships with Meridian Foods. Others appeared to be contacts within Houston's informal economy, people who dealt in cash transactions and asked few questions about the source of funds. The notebook represented a network of information sources and potential accomplices that had never been identified during the original investigation. Detective William Thornton, now working as a consultant on the reopened case, recognized several names from the original investigation files. These were people who had been interviewed briefly in 1974, but dismissed as peripheral figures with no apparent connection to the crime. The notebook suggested that their involvement had been far more significant than investigators had realized at the time. One name appeared repeatedly throughout the notebook with particular emphasis. Carlos Mendoza had been employed as a delivery driver for a janitorial supply company that serviced both Meridian Foods locations and the chemical plant where Roberto Vega worked. During the original investigation, Mendoza had been questioned once and quickly cleared because he had a solid alibi for the night of the robbery. But the notebook entries suggested that his role hadn't been as a direct participant, but as an information source who had provided crucial intelligence about the grocery chain's operations. Mendoza's delivery routes had given him regular access to Meridian Foods locations during business hours, allowing him to observe cash handling procedures, employee routines, and security measures. His work at the chemical plant had brought him into contact with Vega, creating a natural opportunity for information sharing that wouldn't have attracted attention from coworkers or supervisors. The notebook contained detailed observations about Mendoza's delivery schedule and notes about conversations they had shared during routine workplace interactions. The revelation that the robbery had been planned through a network of seemingly unconnected individuals explained why the original investigation had failed to identify the perpetrators. Rather than looking for a traditional criminal gang or obvious suspects with histories of armed robbery, investigators should have been tracking the informal relationships between working-class men who shared information about their respective jobs and saw an opportunity that seemed too good to ignore. The forensic analysis of the buried items provided additional confirmation of Vega's involvement. Fingerprints recovered from the documents matched samples taken from Vega's employment records at the chemical plant. Fabric analysis of the clothing items revealed traces of industrial chemicals consistent with his workplace environment. Most significantly, handwriting analysis confirmed that the maps and notes had been written by Vega himself, using the same distinctive penmanship found in his personnel files and work reports. But the buried cash also revealed the reason why the case had remained unsolved for so long. Among the documents was a detailed plan for disposing of the stolen money that involved converting cash into precious metals, real estate investments, and other assets that would be difficult to trace. The plan called for patience, small transactions spread over many years, and the use of intermediaries who could handle financial transactions without attracting attention from law enforcement agencies. More troubling was evidence that the robbery had been just one component of a larger criminal enterprise. The notebook contained references to other potential targets, including armored car routes, bank procedures, and retail establishments that handled large amounts of cash. While there was no evidence that these other crimes had been committed, the document suggested that Vega and his associates had been planning a series of robberies rather than a single opportunistic theft. The discovery also explained Roberto Vega's decision to leave Houston so abruptly in 1977. Among the buried documents was a newspaper clipping about a renewed FBI investigation into the Meridian Foods case, along with handwritten notes expressing concern that federal agents were expanding their search and might eventually uncover evidence that had been overlooked during the initial investigation. Vega's departure to California hadn't been a routine career move, but a strategic retreat from a situation that was becoming increasingly dangerous. The notebook contained contact information for associates in Los Angeles, suggesting that Vega's relocation had been facilitated by criminal connections who could help him establish a new identity and legitimate employment far from Houston. This network had apparently been sophisticated enough to provide long-term protection for someone carrying proceeds from a major robbery, indicating that the Meridian Foods heist had been connected to organized criminal activity that extended well beyond Texas. As investigators worked through the recovered documents, they began to reconstruct not just the robbery itself, but the entire criminal infrastructure that had made it possible. The operation had required inside information from multiple sources, coordination between individuals with different skills and access, and a sophisticated plan for laundering the proceeds over many years. It represented a level of criminal organization that was far more advanced than anything investigators had imagined in 1974. The case files revealed that law enforcement agencies in the 1970s had been poorly equipped to investigate crimes that crossed jurisdictional boundaries or involved complex financial schemes. The FBI's involvement had been limited to tracking stolen checks and monitoring suspicious bank deposits, but they hadn't possessed the analytical tools or databases necessary to identify connections between seemingly unrelated individuals working in different industries across a large metropolitan area. Modern investigative techniques made it possible to see patterns that had been invisible to earlier investigators. Computer databases could cross-reference employment records, financial transactions, and personal relationships in ways that revealed hidden connections between suspects. Digital analysis of the recovered documents provided insights into the planning process that would have been impossible to obtain through traditional investigative methods. Yet, even with these advantages, key questions remained unanswered. The notebook contained references to at least 2 other individuals who had apparently played significant roles in planning and executing the robbery, but their identities remained unclear. Code names and partial references suggested that Vega had been cautious about documenting the full extent of his criminal network, even in private notes that he had intended to keep buried forever. The recovered documents also revealed that not all of the stolen money had been successfully laundered. References to the reserve fund and emergency cash suggested that significant amounts of currency had been hidden somewhere other than the burial site beneath Vega's house. These references were frustratingly vague, containing location hints that might have been meaningful to Vega, but were cryptic to investigators working decades after the fact. Detective Thornton believed that additional burial sites existed, possibly containing both money and evidence that could identify the remaining members of the robbery crew. The careful way that Vega had preserved the documents beneath his house suggested that he had planned to return to Houston eventually, possibly to retrieve other hidden assets or to settle accounts with former associates. His death in 2018 had prevented any such return, leaving crucial evidence potentially buried in locations that might never be discovered. The investigation had also revealed connections to other unsolved crimes from the same period. Financial records recovered from the burial site contained references to transactions that corresponded to dates when other significant cash thefts had occurred in Houston and surrounding areas. While these connections remained circumstantial, they suggested that the Meridian Foods robbery had been part of a much larger criminal enterprise that had operated throughout the mid-1970s. Federal authorities reopened their investigation based on the new evidence, but the passage of time had eliminated most opportunities for prosecution. Carlos Mendoza had died in 1998, taking his knowledge of the information network to his grave. Other individuals mentioned in the notebook had either died, moved away, or simply disappeared from public records. The statute of limitations had long since expired for most charges related to the original robbery. Yet the discovery beneath Marcus Chen's backyard had finally provided answers to questions that had puzzled investigators for nearly half a century. The Meridian Foods robbery hadn't been the work of desperate criminals or opportunistic thieves. It had been a carefully planned operation executed by individuals who understood both the target and the investigative limitations of their era. They had succeeded not through violence or intimidation, but through patience, planning, and the kind of methodical approach that left few traces for authorities to follow. The resolution of the Meridian Foods case brought closure to a mystery that had haunted Houston's law enforcement community for generations, but it also highlighted the evolving nature of criminal investigation in the digital age. What had begun as a teenager's simple garden project had ultimately exposed the sophisticated criminal network that 1970s investigators had never imagined existed. Marcus Chen's discovery demonstrated how seemingly insignificant details could unravel decades-old mysteries when viewed through modern analytical methods. The concrete slab that had frustrated his gardening plans had preserved evidence that traditional investigative techniques could never have uncovered. Without ground-penetrating radar, digital databases, and forensic archaeology, Roberto Vega's carefully buried secrets would have remained hidden indefinitely. The case also revealed the limitations that had constrained earlier generations of investigators. In 1974, law enforcement agencies operated with minimal coordination between jurisdictions, limited access to financial records, and investigative tools that couldn't detect the subtle connections between individuals working in different industries. The criminals had exploited these limitations systematically, creating a network of information sources and accomplices that remained invisible to authorities focused on more obvious suspects. Detective William Thornton reflected that the Meridian Foods investigation had changed his understanding of how sophisticated criminal enterprises operated during that era. Rather than relying on traditional criminal hierarchies or obvious criminal associations, the perpetrators had built their network through workplace relationships and casual social connections that attracted no attention from law enforcement. Their success had depended not on violence or intimidation, but on patience, planning, and an intimate understanding of how investigations were conducted in their time. The recovered documents suggested that millions of dollars in stolen currency remained hidden somewhere in the Houston area, buried or concealed by individuals who had taken their secrets to the grave. Federal authorities continued to analyze the cryptic references found in Roberto Vega's notebook, hoping to identify additional burial sites or storage locations that might yield both money and evidence. But after 45 years, the chances of recovering these assets seemed increasingly remote. For the families of Meridian Foods employees who had lost their jobs when the company struggled to recover from the massive theft, the resolution brought mixed emotions. While they finally understood what had happened to their livelihoods, the knowledge came too late to restore what had been lost. Samir Khalil had died in 1989, never learning that his trusted business relationships had been exploited by criminals who saw his cash-heavy operation as an irresistible target. The investigation's conclusion also prompted Houston Police Department officials to review other unsolved cases from the same era, searching for similar patterns of workplace infiltration and information gathering that might have been overlooked by earlier investigators. The techniques used in the Meridian Foods robbery suggested a level of criminal sophistication that could have been applied to other targets, potentially explaining other mysterious disappearances of cash and valuable goods during the mid-1970s. Marcus Chen returned to his gardening project with a deeper appreciation for the hidden histories that lay beneath Houston's suburban landscape. The backyard that had once concealed evidence of a major crime now hosts the vegetable garden he had originally planned, though he admits that every shovelful of dirt reminds him of the mystery that changed his understanding of his neighborhood's past. The concrete slab that started it all was carefully removed and donated to the Houston Police Department's training academy, where it serves as a teaching tool for investigators learning about the importance of following seemingly insignificant leads. The case has become a standard example in law enforcement training programs, demonstrating how modern investigative techniques can solve crimes that had seemed impossible to crack, using the methods available to earlier generations. Today, the former site of Meridian Foods headquarters houses a strip mall anchored by a chain pharmacy and a fast casual restaurant. Few customers realize they're conducting business where one of Houston's most methodical robberies was planned and executed nearly 5 decades ago. The building's loading dock has been converted to additional retail space, and the office where Samir Khalil once counted weekend deposits now serves as storage for inventory that moves through entirely different supply chains. The transformation reflects Houston's constant evolution, a city that builds its future on the foundations of its past without always remembering what came before. But in police archives and investigative training manuals, the Meridian Foods case lives on as a reminder that some secrets, no matter how carefully buried, eventually find their way back to the surface. Sometimes it just takes a teenager with a shovel and the curiosity to ask why concrete was hidden beneath his family's backyard garden.